All right, so um, this is another one of our tutorial videos for media style and structure. Hopefully you've been using these and you've been finding them to be useful, finding them to be useful. This one in particular is about passive voice. And so if you recall from lecture and from your readings and from your workbook as well, that we prefer active voice. And and the way you tell the difference between those two is simply it has to do with the subject and whether it's doing the action of a sentence and whether it's being acted upon. So there's some it's not always easy to notice, but once we kind of work through some examples, hopefully it'll be a little more clear. But we always prefer active voice because the action of the sentence, the meaning of the sentence is just not only is it easier to get through, is it easier to take in, but it's also just more. It's just a stronger sentence. It's more. It's just easier to read, and so we want to be sure that our language is active and that our there's not something that's acting upon our subjects rather than having our subjects doing the acting. So anyway, hopefully these examples I'm going to show you here will help. And let's get those started right now. All right, so this is our quick little tutorial on passive and active voice. And we just want to go over some enough examples with this here so we can be able to tell the difference. Once you've kind of seen a few of these, it'll be easier to kind of figure out once you practice some of them. But they might kind of confuse you initially just because it's a little difficult to be able to tell what's doing the action in the sentence. But all it takes is a little practice and we'll get it down. Alrighty, so let's take a look here. So we like our subjects to do stuff and not have stuff done to them. So that's just kind of how we're wired. We like sentences like this one. The soldiers built the hospital there. We do not like the hospital was built by the soldiers. Now, if you get through this second sentence here, you'll note that it's longer, right, than the soldiers built the hospital. But it's also, there's something kind of fuzzy about it, right? I mean, it's like there's, it's almost like there's not much going on in there, but there is obviously some action in there. It's just, what it has to do with essentially is this usage of the verb to be here. Okay, and a state of being, like a being, is not really an action. Okay, up here we have an action. Okay, and we have the soldiers here as the subject doing something. They're building something here. Here we have the hospital just being. Okay, and that's not really very interesting. Okay, and this isn't really. This just really isn't something that readers like to labor through, because not only is it wordy, it's kind of fuzzy, it's kind of hard. Sometimes it's hard to tell what's going on. Sometimes in the longer ones, you'll read them several times and wonder what the heck's happening. So anyway, so we'll go through a little bit more of the mechanics here and so how these will stand out. Well, what we like is for our subjects to do the action and not have something being done to them. Okay, so why is this preferred? Well, what's doing the action? Is it the soldiers or the hospital? Well, it's the soldiers, right? So they're building something. All right, so then the hospital was built by the soldiers. What's the subject? It's the hospital. This is what we need to ask ourselves when we think that we may have some passive voice. Is it doing anything, the hospital? No, it's being built. A state of being isn't an action. Okay? What is doing the action? The soldiers. Okay? But the soldiers are not the subject, right? So that's kind of the problem there with that sentence. All right, so a couple of things we're going to want to look for then. Some dead giveaways, passive voice. We want to look for usages of the verb to be. Now, does that mean that every single usage of the verb to be is passive voice? No, it does not mean that. But it does mean that if we have a usage of the verb to be in there, we want to be sure that it's doing something appropriate, like acting as a linking verb between the subject and say something like a predicate adjective, like she is smart. Okay, that's active voice, right? By, do we have the preposition by in the sentence? That's going to be a dead giveaway there because when we have by, that means there's some sort of action that's going on that we need to attribute to something. Okay? And so the by can either be present or it can be implied. Whenever we see by in a sentence, that means there's an action in a sentence that's not being done by the subject, generally. Okay? So if we have to be and by, boy, we probably really have some passive voice going on there. So we really want to look at that subject and be sure that it's doing the action of the sentence. Okay? So by can also be implied, and this is where people can sometimes get confused. By cannot be in the sentence, but it will still be implied. There will still be sort of an action that needs to be attributed to something. And then that sentence can still be in passive voice. Okay, so we're going to go over some examples of all of those there, so that hopefully we'll clear up any confusion that may have just raised by going through those. All right, so with forms of verb to be, the subject was questioned by police. So what's the form of the verb to be that we have here? Well, we have the past tense, we have was. Okay? And so let's ask ourselves here, is the subject doing anything? No. The subject is having something done to him or her by the police, right? We have by and a form of the verb to be there. That is straight up passive voice. No doubt about that there, because the police are the ones that are doing something. The suspect is having something done to him or her, right? So the way we would fix that is the police questioned the suspect. Notice how we've changed up the subject here. It's the police now, and they are doing something actively. They're questioning the suspect, and the police are not having anything done to them. Okay. All right. The president was impeached. What's our subject? The president. Is he or she doing anything? No. Do we have a form of the verb to be? Yes, we do. We have the past tense, right? Do we have by? We do not. But is by implied? Yes, it is. Yes, it is implied. I'm going to just mute my phone. I'm sorry. That's just getting annoying, I'm sure. So the president is being impeached here. Okay. So, but there is something that's doing that action, right? And it's implied in the sentence here. So this is passive voice. So in order to make this active voice, we would need to know what's doing the action, right? So we don't really have enough information here to correct this one, but we know that it's passive voice, and we want to fix it. Okay. New car chassis were made. Okay. What's the subject? Chassis, car chassis, right? Are they doing anything? No, they are not. Do we have by? No, we do not. Do we have a form of the verb to be? Yes, we do. Okay, we have the plural past tense form, right? So, but by, as you understand here, I mean, you understand that this is there's some action that's going on here again that's not being it's not attributed to anything. It's not being done by anything that we see in front of us here. So there's a by. Our brain wants to attribute that action to something. There's a by that's implied in here. Something that we want to give that action to. We want to know what's producing that action. And we don't have that information in there, but this is definitely passive voice, and it's very awkward passive voice also. Okay? All right. So we don't want to confuse the usage of to be as a linking verb and a predicate adjective, or a past participle uses an adjective as passive voice. Okay, so I mentioned this exception earlier where I gave you the example of she is smart. There, that is not a passive voice sentence there, because even though we have that usage of the verb to be, there's no by in there, right? There's nothing that we want to attribute any sort of action to. Okay, so in that instance, even though we have something that's a subject that's simply being, okay, it's not passive voice. Okay, because there's no action that we want to attribute to something in that sense. Okay, so don't confuse the usage of to be as a linking verb and paired with the predicate adjective. So the linking verb in the example that I gave you was is, right? And the predicate adjective was smart. We were linking up smart with the subject, which was she. Okay, or something like a past participle is used as an adjective. And we'll see. There's some more examples of this on page 74 of your textbook here, but this is a good one. It's pretty similar to one that's already in there, but that's one that you want to pay attention to, because there's a difference between this statement here and the house was burned, right? Because this is the house was burnt. Well, here we have a form of the verb to be as a linking verb, okay? But it's linking up the house with what's an adjective, right? It's burnt with a T. Now, if it was burned with an ed, then it's past tense, right? And so then it's no longer working as a predicate adjective, and actually we have a passive voice sentence if we say the house was burned with an ed. Okay, when we say that, then the by is going to be implied. We want to state, our brain wants to attribute some sort of action to something. Okay, maybe it's a fire. The house was burned by the fire. We also have the house just simply not doing anything, right? It's just being burned by something. So in that sentence, we would say the fire burned the house. Okay, but in this instance here, where we just have burnt with a T, that's just working as a predicate adjective. That's not passive voice. So try not to be confused by that. I know it's confusing, but just I would say know our common predicate adjectives, how they work, and how we list those, and be sure that we're not confusing them with something that's a passive voice. All right. So remember, sometimes passive voice is preferred. We talked about this in lecture. There are some rare times when we like passive voice, and usually it has to do with where we want the emphasis placed in a sentence. And a lot of times this comes up in, say, if you go into crime reporting, if you go into journalism, sometimes you want what is the recipient of the action to be the emphasis of the sentence. Okay, and a good example of this is with crime stories. Okay, a lot of times the way you see these crime stories written, you want to start off with the victim. Okay, because usually there was something horrible that happened, right? We don't want the crime itself or the criminal to be the emphasis of the sentence. We want the human element. We want to always flesh out that human element, right? And that goes for just about anything in communications. We always want to play up the human element. Well, anyway, sometimes that requires us to write in passive voice, and there are a few times where it's going to be necessary. An example is this right here. A Tulsa man was shot Friday outside a convenience store. Well, is the Tulsa man doing anything? No, he was getting shot. So the action is attributed to something else. It's not saying here who actually shot the guy, right? But by is implied. It's passive voice. But again, because this was a crime here, we want the emphasis to be on the victim, right, and not on the crime itself or the perpetrator. Okay. And we got some other examples there on page 75 of your textbook, but they are essentially just they kind of play out along these lines here, and this essentially explains it. If you want some more information, if you have any other questions on it, don't hesitate to ask. Bring them up during class. Bring it up during lab with your TA, or just any type of question you have at all about this. Just let me know. Passive and active voice does kind of confuse people, but we need to know the difference between those, and know that we tend to prefer active voice, but then there are some times when passive voice is totally appropriate. All right.